Everybody, I'm Josh Sawyer. I'm the A project director at Obsidian Entertainment. This talk is on the evolution of RPG mechanics. The title is a bit misleading. This isn't not intended to be a retrospective about RPG mechanics. It's more of a look at the challenges that the RPG industry has faced in adapting from its pen and paper roots to today, which looks quite a bit different in a lot of ways. It's a look at ways in which we succeeded and ways in which we still continue to fail because we don't take player experience into account. So really, game designers, or game developers in general, we're trying to create things that are fun, and fun is the enjoyment of an experience. And there are a lot of different experiences that you can have in ways that you can enjoy having an experience. So tabletop role-playing gamers, they use dice, they sit around with their friends around a table, that's their way of having fun. This is a Street Fighter tournament, obviously a very different type of experience, but they take fun out of the same sort of things. These are tabletop war gamers. This is very similar to tabletop role-playing game. It doesn't have the role-playing elements, but it's the sort of fascination with dice, tabletop miniatures, and wargaming. And then there are LARPers, and they have fun too, and it's a very different style of experience, and they have fun doing it. So there are a lot of different ways that people can have fun with games, a lot of different mechanics that we can use, whether it's in a sort of an offline or tabletop environment or in a virtual environment on a computer. As game designers, we're engineers of these experiences, and really what these come down to is the experiences that people have. We're not making die-rolling simulators. Rolling dice can be sort of fun and therapeutic, but it's about the experience that you have with your friends doing that. And that's often where I think RPG developers have misstepped in not really understanding why things are fun for people. A little bit about my background, which also leads into why this topic is of special interest to me. I grew up in Wisconsin in the United States. For my educational background, I have a bachelor's degree in history from Lawrence University in Wisconsin. After Lawrence, I went to Black Isle Studios, where I was a designer primarily on the Icewind Dale series of games. And after that, I worked briefly at Midway, and then went back to work with a lot of my ex-coworkers at Obsidian Entertainment. And the last project I worked on was Fallout New Vegas, which was published through Bethesda. Prior to that, I also worked on Neverwinter Nights 2, and I did a little bit of system design work on Alpha Protocol. I am primarily a system designer, but more specifically, I'm a system adapter. I don't actually have a lot of occasions where I design systems from scratch. Usually what I'm doing is I'm taking someone else's system, whether it's from a previous game or an existing intellectual property like Dungeons & Dragons, and I'm adapting it for what I'm working on. That might mean sort of interpreting the rules in a new way, or it might mean revising them to reflect just some revelations that the team has had about how the mechanic works or doesn't work. I am a lifelong, or as close to lifelong as you can really be, I guess, tabletop role-playing gamer and CRPG gamer, but over my time as a developer, I've spread out into a number of different genres as a player. So when I look at mechanics, often I compare things to things from other genres that aren't RPGs. I look at action games. I look at racing games. I look at all sorts of different games, and so that's kind of where my approach comes from. My gaming started with the original Bard's Tale on the Commodore 64 and the sort of red box Dungeons & Dragons basic experience. I actually started with Bard's Tale. I was amazed when I saw it on the Commodore 64. The whole idea of this sort of a game really appealed to me. I played a lot of Dungeons & Dragons growing up, all through high school. When I went to college, I branched out into a lot of different new games. This was sort of during what I consider to be a renaissance in PC RPGs. Fallout. The first Fallout came out a little while before I graduated. I thought it was very amazing. Baldur's Gate was the first D&D game that had real-time with pause, which was previously seen in Darklands. I really loved Darklands, and so I thought it was a really cool thing to do in a D&D game. But also I was playing other tabletop role-playing games like Vampire. The storyteller system is very, very different from Dungeons & Dragons, has a very different focus. And also games like GURPS that are extremely rules intensive. And of course, I don't know how many of you know things about the history of Fallout. Fallout originally started as a GURPS game. It was Fallout, a GURPS post-nuclear adventure, and then it was sort of changed at the last minute for a variety of reasons. But in a way, Fallout was an interpretation of GURPS rules. So I've been a developer now for 11 or 12 years, and one thing that I've noticed a lot is as we have continued to develop our mechanics and moved more into simulation rather than sort of virtual die rolling, a common criticism of games is that a certain mechanic is pretty good for an RPG, And it's kind of this backhanded compliment, and it's very frustrating for me, in part because this seems to actually be acceptable to a lot of people, not just gamers, but also developers. They think it's okay to have crummy mechanics in games that aren't very fun. It's considered to be okay to suffer through things that aren't really well thought out or poorly implemented because you enjoy the story. And while I also love stories, and I love the fact that role-playing games empower the player's ability to make choices that are very meaningful, I think that if you're going to ask the player to engage in something that's not conversation and story, it should probably be fun. So I get really frustrated by this, and I say, why? Why does this happen? And I've thought about it for a long time, and I've come up with a number of my own reasons for why I think this happens. First is that we repeat errors over and over again, despite the fact that we get feedback that people don't actually like it. So we'll implement something, thinking that it's a good idea. People will act very frustrated with it, but we keep doing it because it's already part of what an RPG is. We also ignore established mechanics from other genres. So, for example, if we implement action mechanics in a game, we don't actually look at action games to see how they did it, which is kind of dumb because we're trying to emulate something where someone has already succeeded. Even if we diverge, we often aren't even looking at the reference material to make sure that we're at a good starting point. We disregard the actions of smart players. So a lot of times we'll put in mechanics that are degenerate. They cause gameplay that really makes players do degenerate tactics, and they're smart, they figure it out, they do it, but we don't really pay attention to the fact that they're just working around our dumb design, and so we just keep going with it. But despite the fact we don't pay attention to the smart things that players do, we listen to the vocal players, who in many cases are wrong-headed. They might be smart and analytic, but they're going about approaching something in a kind of wrong way. But because they're very vocal, we listen to them a lot. It doesn't always work out for them or for us. But fundamentally, we don't consider really the player's experience to be more important than the ideas that we've had or their expectations. And this really comes back to the idea of fun as an experience. We're creating experiences for people. Everything we put in, whether it's combat or lockpicking, or stealth, or planning out your party. The story itself, obviously, that is an experience that you go through. And we have to think about how a person engages that and goes through it. Often, we as designers get locked on an idea as being the most important part of something, whether it's a quest or a mechanic, or because RPG players from tabletop to computers are extremely analytic, they will analyze the sort of concept of an idea rather than thinking through the practical experience of using that. And often we regard that as more important than how it actually feels to use. And that, I think, is where we stumble quite a bit. So with that in mind, I came up with what I consider to be 5 sort of lessons about developing RPG mechanics that I've stumbled over personally. I've seen a lot of other companies stumble over. And these are things that I've learned and try to apply when I'm developing new mechanics or adapting mechanics for RPGs. The first is that mechanical chaos is frustrating. We use mechanical chaos a lot, random number generators, in tabletop role-playing games, in part because that is the only way for us to simulate things in a tabletop environment. There are other ways to do it, of course, but that's one of the best ways that we have. Sometimes in a different environment, that thing can actually be frustrating. And actually, in some cases where you can reload, mechanical chaos is pointless. It just causes degenerate gameplay behavior. Second, what you perceive is ultimately the most important thing. RPGers often, and developers, we often focus on statistics, things that you can see a number go up and down, but often we can't actually perceive the effects in games. There are a number of cases where I personally have implemented things in games that are completely broken, and players don't even notice it because the effect is imperceptible, practically speaking. That's not really good for making the player feel good about the choices that they're making. Third, strategic failures are often the worst sort of disappointments for players. Role-playing games are often about strategy, how you plan and build your character. Sometimes you're planning and building an entire party. You're choosing equipment. You're making very long-term decisions. Many RPGs effectively punish you for making poor choices, even if the player really doesn't know a whole lot about the effects of the decisions that they're making. That often limits people and makes them frustrated when playing role-playing games. Fourth, the idea of player versus character is a false dichotomy. Often when we ask players to do something in a game, there's a strong argument from traditional RPGers that it shouldn't be me doing the action, it should be my character doing the action. Ultimately, though, games are about the player making use of the resources available to them to accomplish a goal. And really, as developers, we need to think about where we put the point of how much are we asking of the player and how much are we asking of the character that they planned. And that's a delicate balance, and it's kind of nuanced, but ultimately it's a false dichotomy. It's not the player versus the character. It's asking how much the player is supposed to manage of anything at any given time. And finally, and this is more of a summary point, it's not really like it's more of an encapsulating lesson, is that good gameplay is better than whatever your ideas or the player's expectations are. If you make something that is not fun, but you saw your idea through and it met the player's expectations, it's still bad. It's still not good. And so there's a lesson to be learned in the idea that often attempting to execute something because you think it would be a good idea or because players insist that it's a good idea doesn't necessarily produce something that's good. And if you find yourself at a point where you're implementing something bad because of it, you need to step back and reanalyze it. So here are a few words of warning to the audience, or rather sort of exceptions for myself. We all make mistakes, so I've taken a lot of examples from games across the RPG community. I don't have every game from every company in here, but there are a lot of examples. I try to call out our own errors as well. I'm not trying to pick on anyone. I refer to strategy and tactics at various points during this talk, just to be clear, because sometimes there's debate about what this means. When I talk about strategy, I'm talking about things that have to do with planning and logistics, stuff that sort of happens outside the moment-to-moment gameplay. This could be picking what race your character is. It could be choosing perks on level up. It could be picking gear to take out into the field. When I talk about tactics, I'm talking about reactions to the actual events as they unfold. This talk is sort of about the evolution of RPGs, and so it sort of moves away from things that are more more randomized and dice rolly, and towards things that are more simulative. But it's not. I don't view that as necessarily an evolutionary change. That is just the way that the market has changed. A lot of the things that I'm talking about here would also apply to turn-based or real-time with pause role-playing games, where it's more rule-based and less about simulating the player's actions. So I just wanted to make that clear. I refer to a lot of things as RPGs generally. A lot of these things don't even apply to my own standards of what a role-playing game is. I use them because in common usage, people refer to them as role-playing games or role-playing game-esque. So please don't get too hung up on whether I call BioShock an RPG or Deus Ex an RPG or whatever. That's just for examples and because commonly they're referred to that way. But I'm not talking about MMOs. One thing to be clear, a lot of the problems that I'm discussing, they don't exist in MMOs. There are various things about how MMOs work that either alleviate these problems or the problems don't exist in the first place. So I'm not really talking about those games. I'll also exaggerate and I'll say nobody likes something or everybody likes this. I don't actually mean nobody. I know that somebody likes things, even that are very unpopular. It's just usually not a statistical, significantly large group. So as an example, I was not a fan of Braveheart. This is because I'm a history nerd and I got all ticked off about it. But I don't expect anyone to change the way movies are made because I didn't like Braveheart. So when I say nobody, I'm just referring to a very small minority of people. So the first part I want to talk about is that mechanical chaos is frustrating. When I talk about mechanical chaos, I'm referring to randomization and the effects that has. Randomization as a means to resolve a gameplay conflict. This could be combat, it could be picking a lock, it could be passing a speech check, it could be crafting something like a potion, and there's a random chance that it'll blow up in your face. I was actually playing Darklands this weekend as I was coming over, which is based in Germany, so I thought it was appropriate, and I was making potions in my hotel room, and the potions exploded. And that is randomized chaos and very frustrating for the player, especially since you can just reload. So this experience of dealing with mechanical chaos as a means of resolving conflict, especially when the player doesn't have a whole lot of say in how that turns out, is very frustrating. Here's one of the biggest and most obvious ones. So combat, when I first started out in developing games, was mostly a top-down isometric deal where there were virtual die rolls going on behind the scenes, and conflict was resolved that way. So if you were a fighter, you had a pretty good chance to hit based on the armor class, THAC0, all that good stuff. But role-playing games started moving in a direction of being more simulative. But we kept all the randomization and accuracy. And this is one of the more frustrating aspects of role-playing games that I've seen, is that games will insist on randomizing, for example, gunfire. You can see this is the original Deus Ex. And it was very easy to take a pistol and aim it at someone and have a bullet fly off in a completely different direction. But the thing is, we don't really fully learn from this, and we still haven't really learned from this. This is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. This is a game that's based on a tabletop role-playing game. If you've ever played the Storyteller system, if you don't have points in the appropriate skill, you can miss all the time with guns. And this simulates that. It also feels terrible because you're this awesome master vampire, but you can't hit the broadside of a barn with a revolver at 3 feet. It's very frustrating. And Obsidian did it too. We just came out with Alpha Protocol. If you don't have enough points in the appropriate gun skill, you can't hit anything. That sort of a spread pattern is not uncommon to see in the game. But the thing is, no actual human being likes this. It's very frustrating. It doesn't feel good. You start out being terrible with terrible weapons. You're a terrible character. You're terrible with guns. Your guns suck. And so it's very frustrating. So you really struggle to get to the point of competence in the game. And that's not a good experience for the player because, especially in the case of Alpha Protocol, you're supposed to be this, or actually even Deus Ex, you're supposed to be a pretty cool dude when you start out. You're supposed to be pretty awesome already. And you're terrible. And so it's not good feedback. It's not really fulfilling the idea of what the character is supposed to be. And even though maybe it makes sense that if you're not experienced with guns, you can't hit anything, it's not good. It's not fun for the player. And so that's where the experience breaks down. But it applies to a lot of things. We do it in games all the time, especially role-playing games. The example I give here is lockpicking in Fallout 1. But it also could apply to hacking in a lot of games, to speech dialogue checks in a lot of games, to crafting, the example I gave from Darklands before. So you have a check which is purely percentile-based, and the player just goes up, they say, do it, they fail. Well, that's not really enjoyable, so the player typically reloads. As time has gone by, we've moved towards more simulative models. So as you can see here, this is from Fallout 3 or Fallout New Vegas. It's the same system. You can pick locks. And this is a system that you can find in Splinter Cell. You can also find it in games like Thief. And, it feels more or less like you're picking a lock, and the player's doing it. Skill plays a part in it, not a huge part, but a little bit. But the thing is, if you notice in the corner, there's still a percentage chance to just force it, which is an odd sort of relic that holds over. It's based on your skill. It's very role-playing game-like, but all it causes is this. Yay, I'm going to reload the game. If I didn't make the check, I can't get into the container. There's nothing to prevent me from reloading. So any of these sort of checks where there's some really important thing on the line, and if you're going to fail, you completely lose out on something, the player can just reload, and it results in this degenerate gameplay behavior. There's no real reason to continue doing this, but even as recently as Fallout New Vegas, we keep doing stuff like this. Actually, if you've seen Deus Ex Human Revolution, they have a really cool hacking game. It looks really, really neat. But if you look, there's also randomized chances on their little gates that go through their network. So if you hit a bad gate initially, it'll ruin your whole hacking attempt. And the player is sort of encouraged to reload because they blew it, not because they did anything wrong, but because the game just randomly decided, capriciously, you fail. So I want to talk about an example from Fallout New Vegas where I sort of wrestled with a lot of my own personal biases to try to create a good experience for the player without making the gameplay degenerate. So Fallout New Vegas is set in post-apocalyptic Las Vegas, Nevada. It is full of gambling. I don't gamble, mostly because I do a lot of math and realize that it is against me and I will lose. And I also don't find it that fun because I'm too analytical when it comes to it. But a lot of people enjoy it. Even though they know they're losing money, they feel that gambling is exciting. It's part of Vegas culture. Also, because the Fallout franchise already had gambling in Fallout 1 and 2, there's a very high expectation that we would have gambling in the game. So there was a problem, or actually there were several problems. The first is that the players had the expectation of casino games. Right away, as soon as New Vegas was announced, people were saying, hey, what casino games are you going to have? And I was just fuming because I didn't want to have any casino games. Because real casino games are house-biased. It's not very fun for the player if they're just continually losing. And they're all against you. By the way, in case you didn't realize it, don't play roulette ever. It's terrible. You will only lose money in the long run. And of course, it goes back to the problem I mentioned before. You can avoid the results if you just reload. So if you want to put 2,000 caps on black, spin it, and you blow it, then you just reload your game and try it again. It's really pointless. Obviously, in real life, you couldn't do that. But in a video game, there's nothing to prevent you. It's also potentially breaks the economy. It broke the economy in Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. You can just gamble away, and you have loads and thousands of caps, and you can just go and buy everything, and so it doesn't matter what else you do. You just sit at the gambling tables, and now the economy is broken. That's not really good. But if we try to restrict it, the player's going to have a negative reaction, or very likely they'll have a negative reaction, so there's this conflict there. So I was faced with these things. I knew people wanted this. Even though it was frustrating to me, I really understood why they wanted to do it, but I had to resolve these problems. So my approach was to do these things. First was to have 3 low-impact casino games. We also have a game that's not a casino game called Caravan, and that's more of the strategic game, although it's not super strategic, but just 3 low-impact casino games. The AI is not very complex. And basically the resources on our end were not that expensive. Oh, and those games, I should go back. So the games are slots, blackjack, and roulette. Slots is totally random. There's no strategy to it at all. Blackjack, the player does have to use strategy, but the rules for the dealer are very strict. So the player really doesn't use decision-making. There are very strict rules that, even in real casinos, they just follow based on if the player has 16 or less or 17 or whatever the rules of the casino are. So the AI is extremely simple. And then roulette, again, it's completely capricious, totally random. To address the house bias, your luck score, so there's a luck score, and the special stands for all the abilities in Fallout, and luck is one of your stats. So your special score, what it does is it only increases your odds. So even if you have a 1 luck, which is the worst luck you can have, you still get a bonus. So it pushes things back in the player's favor, because if you sat there and just lost all your money, that would be pretty frustrating. If you have a 10 luck, wowee, you win even faster. But basically, it's always a positive gain for the player. Third, there are anti-cheating measures on load. This made some people a little mad, but too bad, suckers. So what happens is, when you load your game, if you load your game and then run over to a roulette table and try to gamble, it says the croupier is taking a minute to check the wheel for bias. If you go to the blackjack table, it says the blackjack dealer is shuffling the decks. And it does this for about 45 seconds to a minute, and it's to prevent this sort of spam. Obviously, a very patient player can get around this, but it disincentivizes players from just doing the kind of brainless, 2,000 on black, I lost, reload, 2,000 on black, reload. So players are more likely to take the results of what they get. The third thing we did is we sort of set and accepted the max winnings from all the casinos. So there are a finite number of casinos in the game, and we have a mechanic that says each casino will only allow you to win this much before they kick you out. And then we just said, you know what, the player can inflate the economy by all the casino's max winnings combined. And the player can exceed it in a few other ways, and that's fine. So we said, yep, the player can flood it with, I don't remember how much it was, but 30,000 maybe caps, and that is okay. Like, we just accepted that's part of the economy. And then what we did is we decided that when the player hit those limits, we would reward them in different ways with things that are not caps. So when you're in a casino and you start winning, once you start approaching the limit, then the floor manager will come up to you and they'll be like, hey, big roller, how's it going? And they'll give you some whiskey, they'll give you a meal. If you do really well, they'll give you a suite there, so it makes you feel like you're really cool. But guess what? You're on a collision course to being locked out of the casino. When you get kicked out of the casino for winning too much, there's actually an achievement that you eventually get called the courier who broke the bank. So in the game, the player is the courier. When the courier breaks all the casinos, meaning they've won the max winnings from all of them, basically like, oh, you're so awesome, you're the hero, you broke the casino, you're amazing. And really, it's our way of saying, please stop gambling at the tables, you're breaking the economy. So we turned what was essentially a negative thing into something that made the player feel really cool because they're the big man. Or lady. So now I just want to look again at sort of randomization and sort of examples of how games have evolved, things that were previously very random and now are more deterministic. So 2 franchises that look fairly similar, although one is a little closer in spacing. So if you look at the Elder Scrolls, if you look at, this is Morrowind. Morrowind, you could swing your sword at a guy and look like you hit him, but still really miss because there were virtual die rolls going on behind the scenes. This is a frustrating experience. Again, because you're no longer looking in a top-down perspective at someone simulating something, you're actually doing it. And so when you swing and you feel like, man, I hit that guy over and over and over again, but it's not doing anything, that's not enjoyable. A general trend that I've found in gaming is it always feels better to hit and do very little damage than to completely miss. But often, a game like this, you would just completely miss. And here's Oblivion. Pretty much looks the same in a lot of ways. The graphics are better. But what they did is they made it pretty deterministic. The collision detection is not very advanced in Oblivion. It's not like a full-fledged action game or anything. But when you swing your sword, if it looks like you hit a guy, you pretty much hit the guy. So this felt more enjoyable. And they still have a leveling mechanic for your skills that makes it feel like you're getting better with those skills over time. But hitting and missing was not part of the equation. So they removed that layer of frustration. Again, this is Deus Ex. I already showed it and talked about it. And Deus Ex Human Revolution, which is, it's not out yet, right? It's coming out very soon, right? Okay. But if you've seen or had a chance to play any of it, it feels pretty much like a shooter. A lot of the guys that worked on it are ex-Splinter Cell guys or ex-Rainbow Six Vegas guys. And so the gunplay actually feels really good. Wow, an RPG with actually good gunplay that doesn't feel extremely frustrating. And I mean, you can get the crap kicked out of you in this game pretty easily, but there's also that spectrum. You start out being a cool security guy who becomes cybernetic, spoilers, and you can use guns and you're not totally incompetent, and over time you become better and better with them. And so it starts out being enjoyable and you become super awesome over time. It's great. Those are good changes. They make the experience more enjoyable for the player and they can still be role-playing games. I just thought that was a funny tagline. So early on in the development of Deus Ex Human Revolution, in one of their ads, they had, this is actually a quote from, I think, Woodrow Wilson. It says, if you want to make enemies try to change something. There's a lot of dismay over a lot of the changes in Human Revolution because Deus Ex is a very beloved game by RPG gamers, or many RPG gamers anyway. But ultimately, a lot of the changes they made make the game feel much more enjoyable. But it was this weird backlash. It was this analytical level of looking at the game from a certain perspective of a hardcore RPGer, but really it wasn't about the experience, it was about the idea of making the change. But ultimately, many of the changes felt very good. Obviously, when I say nobody cares about that, somebody cares about that, just not a huge amount of people. Most people want it to feel good and play a fun game. Even looking at Mass Effect 1 and 2, which have a pretty short distance between their developments, you can see a pretty big evolution in their mechanics, especially their combat mechanics. So if you played Mass Effect 1 and used the assault rifle, I'm just going to say something. The assault rifle feels really bad, especially when you start out. It feels terrible. You can't hit anything with that. It's very, very frustrating. It was a way of differentiating the weapons, but it was kind of irritating in a lot of ways, just to be honest. And in Mass Effect 2, they solved that. The assault rifle feels pretty good. Actually, most of the weapons, they feel a lot better. And what they did is they made it feel more like a traditional shooter in many ways. You can still level up. You can still make your character feel like you're better at using those weapons, but you don't start from a position where you're frustrated by using the weapon because the feel is not quite right. Breaking news, there was a presentation yesterday by Silicosta on developing characters for Mass Effect 3. One of the things that was pretty interesting is that the creatures were essentially developed from a gameplay perspective first. Wowee! Imagine playing an RPG where creatures are differentiated by behavior, not by their stats. It's very, very common for us to think about statistics as a differentiating characteristic of creatures, not behavior. But we're playing in a more simulative environment where you sort of expect the creatures to be differentiated in those manners. So this actually leads into my next point, which is what you perceive in the game is ultimately what matters the most. Which isn't to say that things that you don't perceive don't matter, because they're contributing to something larger, but the things that you do perceive have the biggest impact on the player. Here's a not-so-good example. So I just gave a good example from Mass Effect. Here's a not-so-good example. I won't say bad, I'll be nice. But Mass Effect 1 had a ton of weapons. Like, it just had tons and tons of weapons. There were tons of levels of weapons, and they had a lot of stats. And most of them seem pretty similar within a category. They were differentiated in a few ways, but not really significantly and seriously. They would differentiate, let's say, on a 200-point scale. In some ways, they might be differentiated by 5 or 6 points. That is not statistically a large enough variable to make any difference in how combat feels with that weapon. So actually, this is not just true of RPGs, but a lot of games that have guns. Even Rainbow Six Vegas, if you look at how their gun stats work, from a player's perspective, these bars are differentiated by 5, 10%, and so they all sort of feel the same. That doesn't really make the player feel like they're making a really powerful choice. Because if you think about it, when you're whittling down an enemy's hit points, what are the chances that a 5% difference is going to make you take that enemy down in one fewer hit? because that's what you feel as a player. Blam, 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 blam. If it takes me 4 shots or it takes me 2 shots, that's a difference that I can perceive. If it still takes me 4 shots, but the 4th shot killed him a little more, that doesn't mean anything from my perspective as a player. So that sort of weapon differentiation isn't so hot. However, I will say that between the weapon categories, like I said before, they did feel very, very different. Alpha Protocol. So Alpha Protocol had a stealth system. Not many people liked this stealth system. It was very hard to figure out how it worked. It obfuscated a lot of things, and it didn't give great feedback, and the player was often very frustrated by it. The player could get abilities to upgrade their stealth, but often they didn't really see the effects of it in the game, and so it wasn't enjoyable. So, yep, there's a stealth system there. Yep, there's lots of things and stats and all these checks going on. You're making noise, but it wasn't fun to play just because there was a system there, and the idea of it was a good idea. And I actually talked with the designer of this recently. It was a cool idea. It's just certain aspects of the execution fell short because the player couldn't perceive the feedback. And stealth games really live and die by the feedback that they give the player. And so this was an example where it didn't really work out very well. So this is Fallout 3. There's a little pistol here, and there's that bar down on the bottom that says CND. Does anyone know what condition affects in Fallout 3? Whatever you were going to say, you're wrong, because unless you programmed it, you don't know half of the stuff that it affects. It actually affects 6 or 7 different stats. Did you know that? No way. There's no way to tell. It affects them all on an extremely granular scale. So it affects damage, and that's the most obvious thing, but also affects a lot of subtle things about accuracy. Eventually it affects how the gun jams, but this isn't communicated to the player. So there's this really subtle change in how the weapon works, but because it's so many stats feeding out of one, you can't really perceive it very well. And this is really a minor nitpick. I actually think The Witcher is awesome, but a lot of their core abilities in their tree in the first game, they didn't really do any much. It's a bunch of 5% this, 10% that. And again, this goes back to the idea there's not a lot of great feedback to those things. If you look at the rest of their tree, there are great things like 50% bonus to this or 75% bonus to this. Those feel really good from the player's perspective because they're big changes. But a lot of the foundational ones, and this really, I'm kind of picking on The Witcher because all games do this. Or I shouldn't say all games, but a lot of RPGs will have incremental changes. Mass Effect does it. Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas does it. We'll have skills that produce tiny little changes over the course of the game. It's not that they're bad, it's just that you have to be aware that the player can't really perceive those changes on a small scale. Hey, let's look at some good stuff. In Deus Ex, you can get an upgrade that allows you to carry a turret around and throw it at people. It's 1 point. So you walk around in Deus Ex and you see dumpsters and you see turrets and they say, too heavy, and they shoot at you. Well, the dumpsters don't shoot at you, but the turrets shoot at you. And when you get your cybernetic upgrade and become stronger, you can pick them up. You can pick up the whole thing. You can throw them, you can stack them, you can carry a turret around and shoot it at people and then throw the turret at their face. And it feels awesome. It's a 1 point upgrade, so it's a very coarse granularity change in how you interact with the world. In Fallout 3, Etymologist. This goes back to the idea of a very simple perk that adjusts your damage, in this case against insects. Scorpions are not really insects, but it applies to them. And it's a 50% bonus to damage. 50% is pretty big. And so you can feel that. That translates usually to fewer shots to kill the enemy, less ammo consumed. Feels good. Hey, this is from BioShock. That's the starting revolver on the left, and then the upgraded revolver on the right. One, the visual change is hilariously large. Also, you've tripled the amount of ammo that you can shoot out of this gun, and that feels great. I mean, a 300% ammo increase is very, very noticeable. And then Mass Effect. The guns weren't differentiated that well, but the ammo types were actually very well differentiated. In Mass Effect, if you saw a synthetic target and you used the appropriate armor-piercing ammo, they died super quickly. If you saw an organic target and you used the sort of hollow point equivalent, they died super quickly. It felt good to use the right ammo type. So that feedback was actually really, really good. Now I want to talk a little more about sort of specific examples from Fallout New Vegas and Dungeon Siege 3. So this goes back to player perception. In Fallout New Vegas, for a while I considered doing something that adjusted how much damage the companions did and took. There wasn't a really clean way to do it, and so ultimately I left it alone. But companions in Fallout New Vegas essentially did 100% of their potential damage, and they would take 100% of potential damage coming towards them. So this made them sort of like little versions of you that were following you around. They might not be exactly as tough as you, but they were about as tough as you. In particular, the guy who's standing just to the right of the big Nightkin super mutant, the guy with the beret and the sunglasses, Boone, he is very easily renowned among Fallout New Vegas players for just one-shotting things all over the wasteland. And it's kind of cool in a way, but it makes the player feel like they're not really doing very much often. They can walk around and they'll hear blam, and his rifle goes off and the bolt cycles, and there's just a headless guy over the hill. Good job, Boone, I guess. But the player isn't really doing very much, and so that experience, it's really supposed to be about the player doing things, not the companion, or the companions doing things for the player. So then, on Dungeon Siege 3, one of the things that Rich Taylor, who's the project director, and Nathaniel Chapman, who's the lead designer, what they did is they said, hey, when other players are not controlling the companion characters in Dungeon Siege 3, they do and take 25% damage, which is really, really tiny. That's a quarter. So you'd expect that players would be like, oh my god, this is terrible, this is so stupid. No, not really. Because they're there, they're doing something, you don't have to babysit them, and the player still feels like they're doing the majority of the work. And that's the experience that we want to create. We want the player to feel like they're the one that's doing the heavy lifting, they're the one getting hit in the face the hardest. Their guys are there to help them out, but they're not there to do their work. And ultimately, this change is not visible to the player. It's not like they see a percentage change, and players didn't react negatively to it, at least not that I saw. Nobody had a problem with it. So ultimately, it produced a better experience in the game. Let's talk about one way that I screwed up. So in Fallout New Vegas, I tuned all the weapons. And I had to do a lot of retuning of them, especially the automatic weapons, because they did not feel good. Let's look at one weapon, which is the 9mm submachine gun. This is a very specific example, but it's kind of globally applicable to all the automatic weapons. So my methodology with this, by the way, yes, there are numbers here. I apologize for putting numbers in this PowerPoint. So my approach was initially theoretical, so I put out on a spreadsheet the idea of how I wanted to differentiate weapons within a category, and then by tier, we wanted to create that RPG sense of I've gotten the better weapon, and now I basically like I'm going to kind of chuck the other one unless there's a really compelling reason for me to use it. And also differentiating. I wanted to create character concepts for the player to use. So it was very important that, for example, there were cowboy-style weapons from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, and that there were military-style weapons from the beginning of the game to the end of the game. People create characters with a concept in mind, like I'm a cowboy, I'm a post-apocalyptic cowboy, or I'm a soldier. And making sure that the players had the equipment to do that over the course of the game was very important. So I put a lot of thought into how to balance these things within their tiers and to meet the player expectations. Then I also did time trials, and these time trials were essentially conducted in a kill room called Test Josh Weapons. And it was a bunch of dummies set up, and I would shoot them and record the times, and then I would run around in the field, and I would kill dudes and record the times. And I got a feel for these things, and I thought, yeah, that's pretty good. I think I got it. It wasn't entirely a scientific approach. It wasn't taking a lot of player feedback into account. It was a very narrow scope. It was just me doing it in very specific areas. It revealed some obvious flaws with how I tuned it, but not enough problems. So really, I had thought that when players saw the numbers that were involved here, they would clearly see the obvious advantages and disadvantages of these things. So the Cowboy Repeater does a lot of damage, but it's a slow rate of fire. It is very accurate. The player can't see the spread. 9mm submachine gun, low damage, but look at how much damage it does. That DPS is huge. Clearly, even though it has a huge spread, the player is going to use it. No, nobody used that weapon. It felt really bad. It felt terrible. Really, people found that because it did such low damage, they didn't want to use it against anything that had armor, and because its spread was so bad, it felt like you had to jam it into a target's gut to get it to do anything. So nobody used it. I would watch videos, I'd see people analyze it, and they just didn't enjoy using it. So when I went back, I didn't have to change that much about it. I bumped the damage up a little, and I reduced the spread quite a bit, and that actually made all the difference. And that's what I did to all the automatic weapons. My problem was that I had insisted that people's feedback on it initially from testing was wrong, and that I was right because my narrow scope of testing had revealed a certain result. But really, when faced with the facts that people didn't feel like it was a good weapon, I had to not overcompensate, but I had to really push it to make people feel like it was worthwhile. Third, strategic failures feel really bad, really terrible. Here are some extreme examples of strategic failures that result in bad news. Bard's Tale. You need a bard to win that game. There's a point in the game where if you don't have a bard, you can't go forward. Congratulations. I hope you brought a bard. Thief of Fate. The significance of that title is that you need a thief at the end of the game. That's the only point in the game where you need it, because Tarjan keeps casting Farfo on you and you need to creep up and backstab him. Hope you spent 6 hours in Tarmestia, I think it's Tarmestia, with a thief, because otherwise you can't beat this guy. Here is something that I have a lot of experience with. Most of the games that I've worked on are D&D licensed games. D&D is not a game system for people that are not used to the strategic requirements of it. Again, when I talk about strategy, I mean party planning and character planning. So the first game I worked on was Icewind Dale. This was great because I played a ton of D&D 2nd Edition. Icewind Dale 2. Hey, that was a 3.0 game. You could do a lot of stuff with your characters. You can make these crazy parties. You can combine things in ways that you never could in 2nd Edition. More options equals better than, right? Not really. 3.5 D&D, Temple of Elemental Evil. I did not work on this game, but I think it's a great game. I also recognize that it's a very complicated game and it's very hard for a lot of people to get into. You make a full party, it's turn-based, and it's 3.5 rules. So those rules, combined with full party creation, you're not being asked to make one character, you're being asked to make 5 or 6 characters. Right away, beginning of the game. Start playing the game, make those characters, live with them forever. Or start over, which is, of course, really fun if you found that you made a mistake. The games were tuned for D&D veterans. I found that there was no problem with this. I would tune it for people that had my level of experience, which was 10 plus years of experience playing D&D, totally fine. And there was a really broad level range. What that meant is, hey, there are tons of ways that you can make strategic errors. You can make a dwarf mage. You can make a 4-classed character that just dead ends because their experience penalties are so high. You can buy feats that are completely pointless and don't work well together. There are tons of ways that you can make bad parties. And what happens is then 25, 30 hours into the game, because you're not that experienced at playing D&D, you can't go any farther because the game is too hard for you. That's a strategic failure that is extremely frustrating. And yes, the player made the error, but we placed an extremely high demand on them, which was a very high level of familiarity and prescience about what was going to be expected of them. Compared to something like Neverwinter Nights, it's actually pretty forgiving. One character, simple companions, very streamlined rules in many cases. This is something that at the time I'm like, oh, why did they simplify that? Very simple UI, but it's a lot harder to make strategic errors. And so a lot of ways, Neverwinter Nights is it's an easier game for someone who's new to D&D to get into. Yes, it doesn't give as many options. Yes, you can't tweak quite as many things. We put a lot of that back in Neverwinter Nights 2, and Obsidian worked on Neverwinter Nights 2, but it actually caused a ton of problems. Players, again, could make terrible parties. They could upgrade their companions in terrible ways. It could feel very frustrating to use. Here's another example. Fallout 1 and 2. Don't tag big guns. You're not going to find any big guns. If you've played it, you're not going to find any big guns for about 4 to 6 hours. So if you tag that, and by tagging that means pick it as one of your specialty skills, you're not going to find anything that uses that skill for a very long time. That's a strategic error the player made, but they have no way to know that they're making that error. Fallout 3 should be better, right? No, not really. It was a little bit better. You can find those weapons a little bit earlier, but still you're putting points into something with very limited use, not a lot of weapons, you don't find them that often, and they don't have broad applicability. And that's why in Fallout New Vegas, we essentially got rid of the big gun skill and just pushed all those guns to different weapon categories. So the Gatling laser and the flamer and the incinerator, they all went to energy weapons. The Fat Man and the missile launcher went to explosives, and the minigun went to guns. Not all those things necessarily fit perfectly in those categories, but it worked out fine, and it maintained the idea of, I want to play a heavy weapons character. Later, we even introduced a perk called Heavyweight that reduces the weight of those heavy weapons. You can feel like I'm the dude that carries around the minigun and wastes everything. So we kept the idea. We wanted the experience. We wanted people to enjoy using those weapons, but we didn't want them to have to deal with the weird system that we had set up. By the way, MMORPGs, so I will bring MMOs into this for a bit, they do get it. They allow you to respec. Sometimes there's a cost, sometimes there isn't. In MMOs, obviously, it's very important that you be able to spec things properly and approach things properly. if you change guilds, or if just the needs of a raid change. Or if you don't like something. So they give the player an opportunity to buy out of that. Hell, even Brink gets this. Brink is not an RPG, but Brink has a lot of RPG-light elements in it, and it allows you to buy out of it. We don't allow that a lot in single-player RPGs. I don't see a really compelling reason to not do that, because, like I said, if the player finds out that they don't really enjoy using the things that they bought, that's not a good experience for them. Tabletop gets this too, in a different way. So if you look at 3rd edition D&D, tons of ways to make terrible characters. It's a min-maxer's dream. If you love min-maxing, play 3rd edition or 3.5. 4th edition, they streamlined it a lot. That made a bunch of angry, like, tabletop generals very angry because they couldn't make their, super min-maxed character. But there's a lot of opportunity to make those sort of characters in that game, but the ability for a player to make a lot of bad decisions is removed. The characters are sort of role-oriented, like an MMO. In many ways, 4th edition D&D copies popular MMOs like WoW, which I think was very, very intentional because they understood the idea that a class fits a role. You want to make it easy for the character to fit that role, and for the power player, they can really optimize it. So I'm running a little behind here, but I'll try to speed it up. So the fourth point is that player versus character is a false dichotomy. In every game, you are expected to, as a player, use the resources available to you. You're either strategically making use of those resources, or you're tactically applying them in the field. Obviously, in the case of a role-playing game, you're building that character, but that's still a skill set. As I sort of just described, a player very consciously make decisions about how to build their character. They're doing that. It's not like the character created itself. So really, it's about what do you ask the player to do over the course of the game. If you think about chess, I know this isn't regular chess, but I just found this image and I thought it was great. If you play regular old chess, the demands and constraints, it's relatively slow paced. Even if you're playing speed chess, it's one-on-one. Your strategic and tactical concerns are pretty gated. How many people are familiar with bug-out chess or Siamese chess? Show of hands, anybody? Wow, like 2 people? So Siamese chess or bug-out chess is a game where, as you might imagine, you're playing with 4 people. Your partner is the person diagonal from you. They're playing they're playing the opposite color. And what happens is they take pieces and then give those pieces to you that you can then place on the table. As you might expect, this changes the dynamic of chess a great deal. A lot of chess teachers really hate it because it changes the mentality a great deal. It's a different expectation and different demands of what the player is expected to do. Take something like Baldur's Gate 2. This is a real-time with pause game. You have a big party. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's not quite the same thing as a turn-based 3.5 game. All those icons on the top are participants in that battle. That's a huge battle. But it's turn-based, and so the player can take things one at a time. It's a different feel to how the game is played. So again, you have to be cognizant of what you're asking of the player. If you look at something like The Witcher, or The Witcher 2, The Witcher has no party, really. It's mostly about Geralt, and there's the strategic element of how you build Geralt, there's the tactical element of what weapons you're using, and then it's about the moment-to-moment visceral gameplay of actually swinging your sword and dodging and doing all that sort of stuff. Obviously, The Witcher 2 built even more on this and made it feel much more player-controlled. So you have to be cognizant of what you're demanding of people. In a game like Dragon Age 2, you have a party to manage, or Dragon Age 1 or 2, you have a party to manage, and you do have action game combat, but the demands are not super high for the player in terms of what the action demands of them. And this isn't really about whether an RPG gamer can play Twitch gameplay. It's about just understanding that if the player is expected to manage a whole bunch of stuff, you shouldn't also expect them to be a master of the sort of real-time combat. Dungeon Siege 3 is a little lighter on the party management, and so it's heavier on the action game elements. But even so, we're still not making Ninja Gaiden Sigma. If you want a player to do all of that action, you can't also ask them to build their characters, maintain a party, watch out for them, manage them. That's too much stuff to ask them. So this player versus character dichotomy is more about their mental awareness and their ability to sort of engage what's in the game. But it's not just about physical stuff, it's also about mental resources. At the end of Neverwinter Nights 2, I designed a boss battle that is extremely demanding. It is very long. It requires a lot of resources. I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a scroll bar because you have even more party members. You have every companion that you've had in the game, minus a couple that betray you. Spoilers. You You have to manage all of them. All those icons are effects that are added on. It is crazy. RPG purists might say, like, I've played tougher. But that's kind of the point, is that if you're not a hardcore RPG gamer, that's extremely frustrating. It's a lot to ask of people. And there can be range within genre. It doesn't mean that there's like a sweet spot for how much you ask of them. Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas are really games about exploration, and so the combat is not extremely challenging. There's VATS to fall back on if you get sort of flustered and fall back. It's really about sort of the role-playing experience in the environment. If you look at Mass Effect is not really about exploration. Mass Effect is a lot of cover-based combat, a lot of conversation, and so the combat in Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2 is more challenging because it expects more of the player because it's more of a central component of the game. And it doesn't just have to do with combat. You can also apply it to things like stealth. Again, Oblivion, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, shadow-based stealth. The player has to use darkness, move from shadow to shadow, be aware of the characters in the environment. Something like Deus Ex Human Revolution actually does not use light at all. It uses just line of sight. But the combat is cover-based, and so they use kind of a Rainbow Six Vegas-style cover system to lean, make sure the coast is clear, and then roll out. And so it's a different approach. In both cases, they're not hardcore stealth mechanics. You're not playing, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, but they're still rewarding mechanics to use. And ultimately, that brings me to the sort of summarizing point. This isn't a point with a ton of examples. This is really the encapsulating idea. The idea is that good gameplay ultimately is what you want to create because that'll produce good experiences for people. It's more important than your ideas, and it's more important than even player expectations. Because again, if you create a game with bad gameplay that was the result of your idea and it met player expectations, it's still bad and it's still frustrating. And it continues the sort of cycle of RPGs having mechanics that aren't very fun because that's just the way that RPGs are. And it doesn't really have to be that way. And we're already getting a lot better of it, but there's a lot of work to do. There are a lot of really cool games that have come out in the past year and are coming out in the next year. They're getting a lot better. I gave a few examples of ways in which we're improving. We have Skyrim, obviously The Witcher 2 came out, Mass Effect 3 is on the horizon, and of course I'm going to plug the game that I just made at the end. But there are a lot of ways that we can still improve RPG mechanics. We don't have to look at things, we don't have to meet the bar set by other games that are industry leaders. We don't have to be as good of a shooter as something like Call of Duty. We don't have to be as good of an action game as something like Ninja Gaiden Sigma. But if we ignore the lessons that those games teach us, then we're really limiting ourselves and we're limiting our ability of our audience to have fun. Thank you. I went over a little bit. Do I have like 5 minutes? Do I have any time? No one's saying no, so I guess I have time. I wanted to thank a few people. They're listed over on the right. These are people from my company that helped me either get here or reviewed my work. Obsidian's website is listed at the bottom. My email right below it, and my Twitter. I don't actually tweet, just a word of warning, I don't really tweet about work stuff. I tweet about cats and cheese and stupid things. So don't go there expecting to get the inside scoop on anything because I don't really give the inside scoop. Does anyone have any, I don't know if we have a mic floating around, but does anyone have any questions? Nothing? All right, thanks everybody.